Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of conversations that the Oxford Martin School has been arranging around the broad topic of what having gone through a pandemic means going ahead, thinking about the major challenges of the 21st century. Before introducing our two guests this afternoon, can I welcome all our external audience, and can I encourage you to ask questions? If you look at the bottom right of your screen, you should see a little button there that says ask a question, and you have the opportunity to type in a question there, and you also have the opportunity to vote on a question, and it's really helpful for me in asking questions to our guests to know which are those that most people are most interested to get answers for. And just to remind you that we are recording this session, so if you ask a question, your name may go live. So let me go straight to introducing our two guests. We're hugely lucky to have this afternoon two of Britain's most distinguished economists. First, we have Paul Collier, who's Professor of Economics and Public Policy here in Oxford at the Blavatnik School. And Paul is also a professorial fellow at St. Anthony's. Paul founded at Oxford the Centre for the Study of African Economies and has had many roles outside Oxford, including a 5-year secondment to the World Bank and many advisory roles within UK government and foreign governments as well. Paul writes for both a technical and a general audience. And among his books of more general audience, which many of you I know will recognise, is The Bottom Billion, The Plundered Planet, The Future of Capitalism, and most recently, Greed is Dead, which is the book that we're going to talk about this afternoon, and which he wrote with our second guest, John Kay, again, one of the UK's major economic thinkers. John has been an academic at Oxford and the LSE, journalist in the Financial Times, research director at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, as well as many roles in the private sector. With government, John published in 2012 a major report, which has become known as the Kay Review on UK equity markets and long-term decision making. John also writes wonderful books for a general audience, and these include Other People's Money, Other People's Money, there's a subtitle, The Real Business of Finance, recently with Melvin King, Radical Uncertainty, and the book that we're going to be exploring some of the issues around this afternoon, Greed is Dead. And of course, Greed is Dead reminds us deliberately of the film Wall Street and the famous remark of Gordon Gekko, greed is good. And I think when we all saw the film, as non-economists, we sort of assumed that that was a caricature. But as you talk about in the book, in some ways, greed is good is a statement of a political philosophy, and one backed up by a lot of equations. John, could I get you to explore some of these issues and your concerns around what you call the economic individualism that this economic philosophy has engendered?
It's interesting, Charles, that you lead into it in that way, because a friend of mine who was working for an investment bank at the time took a group of clients to a showing of that film. And he told me that the majority of the clients who went there genuinely did not understand that this was not intended to be a sympathetic portrayal of Wall Street. They thought this was what it was like, and good on them. Mm. And that was what happened right the decade of the 80s. And that was, in a sense, my experience too, because as you mentioned, I taught economics in Oxford for many years. And when I taught students, beginning students economics, I taught them models based on maximizing rational individuals. And when I became engaged with the business world, I realized that it wasn't really like that. It wasn't like it for two reasons. One was that people actually have multiple motivations, and while they have material ones, they're only part of what they have. And secondly, they couldn't optimize, they couldn't maximize in the way they did in my models, because actually we don't know enough about the world to be able to optimize. And that has influenced me ever since. But what I also realized was that the models which I had been teaching had actually come to have a huge influence on what was actually happening in the world. That we had the cult of shareholder value, we had the explosive growth of the financial sector, so that it became, as it were, self-fulfilling. It was a world of greedy people, and in a world of greedy people, there is very little you can sensibly do yourself except be greedy. And the result of that was the kind of sale of worthless products that led up to the 2008 financial crisis. The result of that was the explosive growth of executive remuneration. And most of all, the result of that was actually the decline of what I call the iconic companies of British industry. That ICI was Britain's leading industrial company for most of the 20th century. It disappeared in the first decade of the 21st. The second largest industrial company in the 1990s was GEC, to which much the same happened. And Marks and Spencer in the 1990s turned its focus to increasing profits, to making profits of £1 billion a year, which it did once in 1998. And then its sales fell off a cliff. People no longer regarded Marks and Spencer with the awe they once had done, and they have never made that level of profit again. It was actually a selfishness that destroyed motivation and actually destroyed many great companies.
To what degree was the structure of business determined by the underlying prevailing economic orthodoxy, or was it the other way around, that the orthodoxy was developed in order to support the people who were making a lot of money from the prevailing business structures?
I think they were mutually reinforcing, that people in business weren't being influenced by the mathematics, which I taught students in elementary courses. They were being influenced by the fact that this orthodoxy worked rather well for them. And we saw the amazing amounts of money that were made by employees in the financial sector. And we saw the ways in which, as I've described, executive remuneration exploded. I remember once taking a retired chief executive of a major British company to my class at London Business School. And at the end of it, he said to me, you know, these kids regard being chief executive of a company as a prize rather than a responsibility. And that sentence encapsulated for me the change in the business world which had occurred.
If I can go off on a slight trajectory, because you've been talking about teaching economic models and the assumptions that makes about the knowability of the future. And you've written recently with Melvin King, as I mentioned in the introduction, your concern about how much economic theory is based on assumptions about knowability. How badly is that affecting economic policy making at the moment?
Quite badly. And was very much part of what was the lead up to the financial crisis. The belief that we could control things with models because we had a knowledge and understanding of the world that we didn't have and couldn't possibly have. In the book, we talk about the famous statement by David Vinaar, who was CFO of Goldman Sachs at the time, who said, as the financial crisis broke, we've been experiencing 25 standard deviation events several days in a row. Now, you don't have to know very much about statistics to know that it's impossible to experience 25 standard deviation events. What he meant, of course, was that the Goldman Sachs models didn't even begin to describe the world in which Goldman Sachs were actually operating. And similarly, even now, macroeconomic policy is influenced by frameworks concerned with rational expectations and general equilibrium, which bear very little relation to the way in which macroeconomies actually function.
And so much of which is based on maximizing personal utility, which is the sort of two planks of your concern about individualism. And the other part, perhaps if I could turn to Paul, is your concern about political individualism. And there, although very few people will get up and defend Gordon Gekko, then you mount a broadside against a political philosopher, John Rawls, who many people, especially on the left, sort of consider almost a secular saint. Might you tell us a little bit about your concerns about this strand of political individualism, especially on the left of centre?
Sure. So our philosophical saint is Michael Sandel, who's got this wonderful new book, The Tyranny of Merit. Whereas Rawls was concerned with what he called distributive justice, Sandel has a much more felicitous phrase, it's contributive justice. And let's build to what that means. We are as keen on rights as anybody else, right? We don't want a society without rights. But rights without obligations are completely empty. Rights depend on someone somewhere having obligations to fulfill those rights. So the easy bit is claiming the rights. The hard bit in generating rights is generating the obligations. Where do they land? And the difference between Rawls and Sandel is where those obligations land. Because what we've actually lived through over the last 40 years is people increasingly claiming rights, whilst they walk away from obligations. Robert Putnam has a marvelous new book called The Upswing, where he plots, amongst many, many other things, but one ingenious and rather sort of graphic little thing is how many times you observe the word me compared to the word we. So do people see the world as me or as we? And what we find is from Putnam is there's a systematic inverted U. From 1900 looks very much like 2020, and it's the ascendancy of me. The me to we frequency is at its peak both in 1900 and 2020. And since about the mid-60s, we've seen a steady decline. The peak of we society was in the 60s, and we've seen a steady decline, a retreat from we towards me. And the counterpart of that is me just wants rights, obligations of someone else. And so where the obligations land now with the state. And that doesn't work. The state gets completely overburdened with obligations, and all of the individuals in it say, not me, I don't want to pay tax, I don't want to do this, I want my individual freedom. And you know, we've seen very recently that individual freedom sometimes comes at the expense of the common good. So the secret of building rights robustly is mutuality. And this is what contributive justice means. Everybody needs to be contributing. They need to be morally load-bearing so that we all contribute to the whole. Now, why do we need that? Partly because otherwise these obligations can't be met satisfactorily, but mainly because it gives us all agency. If we are all agents in the common good, then we all own that common good, and we have dignity. The distributive justice notion was what encouraged New Labour to put the north of England on Benefit Street. People are just consumers. They echoed, actually, Economic Man. In Economic Man, the only thing that gets us higher utility is our consumption. You know? Obviously, with real people, what gives us I don't even like to call it utility, but if we express it in economic terms, what people value is not just their own consumption, it's the respect that they get from others. They get self-respect from being valued in a community. And that building of a rich, dense web of mutuality is what makes a great society. If we look at the societies which routinely top all the measures, both of income, equality, well-being, it's places like Denmark and Norway. And they're just webs of mutuality. They're so good at building common purposes and then sharing out the obligations to meet them. That's why, as we'll come to, I guess, they've had such a successful experience with COVID. Everybody's willing to behave responsibly.
And clearly, political philosophers can provide a rationale for these movements, but they don't drive them. And I was wondering the degree to which you think that this rise of individualism within, say, our country, the UK, has been driven, first of all, by, well, to use David Goodhart's phrase, that the society is now split into people who have a sense of place, the somewheres, as opposed to the nowhere, the anywheres, I beg pardon, and also the issues around meritocracy, that we have a meritocracy, and many people automatically think that by definition a meritocracy must be good, forgetting that it disadvantages a very large fraction of society.
Well, it depends what we mean by. I mean, it's obviously good that competent people should be holding responsible positions. So the critique of meritocracy is not saying let's have random incompetence. It's obviously not. I think there are two. I don't particularly like the somewhere everywhere or whatever. I prefer the concepts which are actually economic concepts, insiders and outsiders. And insiders are the people who are basically close to power. And Britain is so centralized, both political power in London and financial power in London, that the Londoners and Oxford, sort of almost London by the sea, as it were, that we're naturally closely connected, and we don't even realize that most people are not like that. Most people are outsiders. So the concept was coined with reference to the labour market. The people who were secure in their jobs, exemplified by academics, and the people who weren't, who were in precarious jobs. And so that's, I think, the one fundamental distinction is the outsiders got such a bad experience, and the insiders had such a good experience. The insiders who were running things, that's a definition of insider. They're the people with influence, both in finance and in government. The insiders didn't even realize what was happening with the outsiders, how life was like for them. And the other concept is this meritocracy. Why is Sandel critiquing meritocracy? Because the insiders who are so successful come to believe that the reason they're so successful is they're individually brilliant. That's the individualism bit. And so they think, I'm really successful because I deserve it. That's the move that makes meritocracy stink, because what's then the narrative by extension with the people who don't make it? You've not made it because you're no good. You deserve to lose. And that leaves these people bereft of dignity, because the narratives of the insiders actually become the dominant narratives in the country. Even some of the outsiders pick them up and start to see themselves in that light. And insult to injury.
Michael Young, who coined the phrase meritocracy, wrote the book The Rise of the Meritocracy. And many people don't realize now that what he was describing was a dystopia.
Yes.
And 30 years after he wrote the book, he wrote an article describing the extent to which what he had predicted in that book had actually come to pass. With a striking phrase, I think, when he said, "What is it like in a meritocracy to be told you are without merit? No underclass," he said, "has ever been left as morally naked as that." And we need to understand that the things that concern people today, people talk almost endlessly about inequality. But this is not about inequality in the sense of inequality of incomes. That may be part of it, but it's not the essence of it. It's a sense of being respected, which has gone from the kind of communities that in which working class people voted for Trump, in which they voted conservative, not just in 2019, but have been voting conservative in increasing proportions for the last 50 years. And we see similar kinds of developments in Germany with the rise of AfD, and in France with the activities of the Gilets jaunes.
And of course, the man who coined meritocracy was the same man who had written the Labour Manifesto of 1945. He wasn't a high conservative. He was a passionate Labour supporter, but he was seeing the danger of basically of the insiders, both on the left and the right, walking away from ordinary people. The right never engaged with ordinary people, but his worry was that the left was walking away from ordinary people, the organized insider left.
And of course, that's what we've seen in political parties of the left across the Western world, whether it's the Labour Party in the UK, the Democrats in the US, SPD in Germany, or, well, the French left has essentially collapsed in this sense. It's a division between the meritocrats who have made it and are obsessed with issues of identity politics, who are entirely divorced from the traditional concerns of the left with the needs and aspirations of working class people.
And I think the message about a greater equality of esteem is important for everyone. It's perhaps particularly important for us in such privileged positions as we are in Oxford. One of the fascinating things in your book is you talk a little bit about the history of communitarianism, taking it all the way back to Adam Smith and pointing out, as other people have done, that he wrote 2 books, and that the theory of moral sentiments has many of the things that are not associated with free markets. And of course, communitarianism over the years has had a pushback from other liberals, with accusations that it can lead to the society determining moral norms and forcing conformity and inhibiting liberty. And it points to some of its origin in, for example, Catholic communitarian. How do you respond to the classical liberal attacks on communitarianism?
It's an interesting question, and of course the revival of communitarianism actually came in large part from Oxford with Elizabeth Anscombe and Charles Taylor, followed then by, and it's quite important to say he's a Catholic, or he became a Catholic, Alistair MacIntyre. I mean, Paul said Michael Sandel was his philosophical hero. I think mine is MacIntyre, because actually it was MacIntyre who introduced to me the idea of Aristotelian ethics, virtue ethics, essentially, and took me from that. And took me from that to understanding that what one meant by a good business was actually the same as what one meant by was also what one meant by a good person, and in a metaphor that struck with me, a good knife. It was someone who did well the kind of things which one associated with the attributes of that particular activity. And that sense of good is the same whether you apply it to a knife, a person, or a business. Oddly, of course, McIntyre had and most of the people we've been talking about, had an extremely negative view of business. And if business represents itself in the way in which we've been describing earlier in this session, one can perfectly understand that. But equally, Paul and I take the view that some of the most important communities which we have in our societies are businesses, and that people derive the respect and the dignity which they need in their lives from the work they do.
Paul, did you want to come in on criticisms of communitarianism?
Yeah, I really want to say that there's now a new wave of communitarian thought, which is really quite an astonishing upsurge and very recent. It really is a sort of sea change in the intellectual community away from individualism, and I think it doesn't suffer from the traditional criticisms. So I've already mentioned in philosophy Sandel, in politics Robert Putnam's wonderful new book The Upswing, which looks at the sort of the correlated effects of changes in culture, changes in political systems, and changes in economic outcomes, with economic inequality being a lagging variable. So it's not it's not the cause of the problems; it's a consequence of other problems. What else? If we turn to in economics, we've got Raghu Rajan's wonderful book, The Third Pillar. You know, Rajan, Chicago professor who's at the business school, the epicenter of Friedmanite economics 50 years ago, and he's saying no, you know, move on from that. Rajan, who was also the chief economist of the IMF, also governor of the Reserve Bank of India, so major figure. Rebecca Henderson, the top dog professor at Harvard Business School, you know, in Reimagining Capitalism, A World on Fire. All these books have come out in the last 12 months, and there are plenty more of them. So there is this sudden, so it's what Putnam refers to as an inflection point, a moment when intellectual thinking really is decisively shifting from individualism.
And presumably this inflection was before the pandemic. And do you think the pandemic will have accelerated that inflection, just forcing us to realize that our welfare depends on the people around us?
That's a strategic question, because Putnam tries to understand why was this inflection point in the 60s, what happened, and he's basically arguing it's to get the change. To get the momentum reversed, the direction of momentum reversed, it takes rather a lot. It's not just a shift in intellectual thinking. It's the coincidence of the shift in intellectual thinking with a major shock that happens to illustrate the critique launched by the ideas. So, John and I were students of the mid-60s. You know, we were creatures of this cultural revolution, the Soissons-Huitard. And what was the big idea then? It was a critique of authority. It was saying authority is discredited. And then along came Vietnam. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill that day? Followed by the inflation of the oil shock and mass unemployment, stagflation. Discredited, authority was discredited. So that combination of a shift in ideas perfectly illustrated by a major shock.
And one shouldn't underestimate the importance of the financial crisis of 2008, I think, which revealed not only that there were many greedy, overpaid people in the financial sector, but they weren't actually even very good at what they did. And the impact of that, together with the rather inept, competent in the short run, but inept in the medium to long run, political responses to that nothing much happened except to try and keep the show sort of on the road, is, I think, a fundamental cause of the kind of erosion of the values, both positive and negative, which were around before that.
So the economic shock is and it's the lagged effect of that catastrophic shock, the worst for 80 years. The political shock, the equivalent of Vietnam, discrediting authority, is the onset of COVID. I mean, there is this ludicrous fact, it's so ludicrous that it's hard to credit, but the assessment by Gates and a whole consortium of NGOs on which countries were best prepared for COVID, top of the list was the United States and Britain. Oh yes, so just here was two states that were completely overconfident in their ability to handle COVID, just like an overconfident chief executive thought he was the commander-in-chief of a company. And so we had commanders-in-chief who were pulling levers, and the result was the highest excess deaths in the OECD. So that's the same shock, the same character of a shock.
Sorry, Paul, I spoke over you. Just on inflection points, there's also a narrative at the moment that we have seen a different type of inflection point, which is a radical move to popularist politics throughout the West. Can that happen simultaneously with the movement, at least in the academy, along the line you've just talked about, much greater discussion of communitarian? And is that the dialectic that we're going to see played out over the next decade?
I think so. I mean, there's no surprise that a discrediting of authority opens the door to charlatans, populist charlatans. Of course, when authority is discredited, who's going to walk in? It's the celebrities who decide, oh, I'll be a politician now, right? And equally, when authority is discredited, what's the alternative to that? It's the hard business of serious thinking, of trying to understand why was there that so utterly false assessment of preparedness. Obviously, the intellectual work of the previous 40 years hadn't even prepared for the understanding of, for example, what is it to be prepared about against a pandemic. They were totally wrong. That's the legacy of 40 years of individualistic academic thinking. And so there is a huge task of rethinking, which is now underway.
There's also a longer-term tendency, trend, which started, I think, when the Berlin Wall collapsed and communism with it. And that really deprived the left of its traditional organizing intellectual framework round about various varieties of socialism. And that's left the left of the political spectrum, left parties, somewhat at sea since then. It was papered over for a bit by clever pragmatists like Clinton and Blair, but has not survived in the long run. And also less obviously, the parties of the right in Europe and the US were largely composed of people, particularly in Europe and Britain, were composed of people who were in one way threatened by the socialist doctrine, whether it was business people or nationalists or people who were social conservatives or whoever. People had not very much in common with each other, except that this was a threat to where they stood. So that both the parties, the traditional parties of the left and the right, lost the glue that had kept them together for the previous 100 years.
So in your book, you talk a little bit about how you would like to see politics to develop. And might we explore some of the issues around inclusive politics and participatory politics, and how one can have more engagement without going to extremes of referendum and things?
Yeah, so I think Britain is not just the most spatially unequal society in the OECD. It's also the most centralized. Government highly centralized in Whitehall, finance highly centralized in London. And so one really urgent and important step is the devolution of both the power of government decisions, devolution to regions and cities. Now, that phrase "take back control," which won a majority in the country, wasn't really about take back control from Brussels. I mean, damn it, Brussels only controlled 1% of GDP. It was really a message: take back control from London. Every region of England and Wales, other than London, voted Brexit. It was a mutiny against London. So take back control really means devolve power of political decision to the regions, and exactly the same in finance. The most disturbing financial number I know, John knows this more, but 2/3 of all the venture capital for small firms in Britain is allocated to firms in the southeast, London and the southeast. Now, venture capital is the stuff which scales up small firm opportunities. So the jobs and successful firms of the future, on present form, 2/3 of them are going to be in the southeast. That will drastically amplify, aggravate our spatial inequalities. And so what needs devolving is not just government, but finance. And finance has become more and more centralized. So part of the answer to participatory government is devolution. If you devolve power of decision, both financially and politically, you shorten the distance between people and power. The insiders will hate it because their distance to power gets longer, but the outsiders, the distance gets shorter.
And are you encouraged by metro mayors and the increasing power that some of the quite impressive people holding these jobs are wielding?
Yes, I think that's the obvious. We should build on what we've got. Britain's political geography is a complete mess, but rather than spend the next 20 years trying to go from scratch to put it right, let's build on what we've got. And what we've got is the metro mayors and the metro regions, which on the whole are coherent economic geographies.
John, I'd like to ask you, you talked in this book and in your previous writings, and you touched on it earlier, about the transformation of business. And we've seen over the last few years, at least as a narrative, much more talk about stakeholder capitalism, about purpose. Are you encouraged by what's happening? Do you see it? Is it going to make substantial change at scale? I guess is a question I'd like to know.
I think we've a lot of work to do to make a proper change at scale. I mean, talk about purpose is an advance, but it's very easy to write a statement of purpose that is essentially vacuous in its content, and that's what a large number of businesses are doing. What we need is actually a change in culture in this sense. I go back to my ex-CEO who observed running a business, being CEO of a large business is, he was saying, a responsibility, not a prize. You are, as it were, the trustee of an organization, and it's thinking in these terms. If the purpose of business is to create shareholder value, then I don't think there's anyone who goes to work in the morning, jumps out of bed in the morning and says, I must go and create some more shareholder value today, or comes home and said, I did well today, I bet the shareholders are pleased. People derive intrinsic satisfaction from jobs that are worthwhile, that they believe are worthwhile. And it's very difficult to see how anyone could think it was Anybody must have prayed people who think it was worthwhile to sell people collateralized debt obligations they didn't understand, or to promote opioids to people who shouldn't have been consuming them.
So how will that culture change happen? Will it come endogenously from new generations of people within business? Or is it the role of government to set the boundary conditions to make it happen? Or even more broadly, just all of us in civil society to set the rules that it's easier for the private sector to have these multiple goals?
Yeah, I don't think government can do very much to promote this. But actually the rhetoric changed. The negative change in rhetoric happened over kind of 20, 30 years, from late 70s, early 80s, probably up to the financial crisis. That if I look for extreme statements about the importance of shareholder value and the like, I mostly find them in the era before the financial crisis. Business has been a bit more hesitant about representing itself in this way in the last 5-7 years. And we're seeing much of that in the discussion about purpose that you're well aware of, things like the Rebecca Henderson book that Paul was describing and so on. I think it's a culture change which can happen only relatively gradually. And I think there's a lot of naive discussion about the views and ideas of millennials and the like, but that firms realize they have to change the ways in which they behave in order to continue to attract good young people to go and work with them.
So if I may, sorry, Paul, go on.
I was just going to say here, COVID is an amplifier, because if we wanted one thing that really illustrates why my rights without my obligations doesn't work, it will be COVID. If we look at the successful societies, New Zealand, which eliminated COVID, Denmark, which never had a first wave, never had a second wave. What did they do? They were both led by leaders who were modest, both young women with children of their own, who talked about we, not me. They didn't say, I'm the chief in charge here, I know what to do, obey me. The Prime Minister of New Zealand always said, we are a team of 5 million. Who was the team of 5 million? All the citizens, all the residents of New Zealand, all had responsibilities. Right? Exactly the same in Denmark. We. And what was the message? What is your responsibility? You've got to protect your neighbor. Don't behave in infinite liberty in a way that exposes other people to risks. And then both of those societies were already pretty communitarian. But then I go across the Atlantic and I go back to last March in the United States. And the United States had been saturated in 40 years of individualism. Indeed, there are measures we can show up on pictures that America's sort of epicenter of individualistic thinking. And what's the image I take from last March, when the American population finally woke up to the thought of COVID? It was queues, long queues outside gun shops.
Yes.
Not so much protect your neighbor as shoot your neighbor. And we now know that shoot your neighbor isn't very effective against COVID. And so that contrast between societies which learnt how to build common purpose, common obligations, mutuality, and contain the disease, and those which bragged about their rights and have really lost control of it, that is a graphic illustration that plays into the intellectual shift. It illustrates that intellectual shift.
So if I may, I'm going to turn to some questions that have come in, and we have lots of questions and people have voted. So I'm just going to go for the ones that are most highly voted. This is a question from Andrew Hallam. We tend to think of greed as something that afflicts the rich, but these days we all want more, driven by the systematic creation of dissatisfaction through marketing, and secondly, by the hunger for positional goods, so well analysed by Robert Frank. This mass form of greed seems unsustainable because it drives ever higher material throughput in the economy for a growing population. How can we get sustainable limits on mass greed? John, can I go to you first on that?
I think there's a misunderstanding in that kind of question, which is that a failure to realize that in advanced Western societies, what growth means is typically better, not more.
Mm-hmm.
And a good way of looking at, a striking way of looking at it, which we just happened to be doing in the last couple of weeks, is to take products over the last century or two and ask their weight, the ratio of their weight to their value. And well, the Pfizer vaccine is off the scale in terms of value for weight, but so actually is the iPhone, or for that matter, the Airbus. We're not primarily wearing more clothes. In the US, we are eating more food than we were 50 years ago, but again, in Europe, we're not. And if you have a lot of money, you go to a gym in order to keep yourself slim, rather than, as was true historically, eat as much as you can where you can. I think I don't see that there's an incompatibility between economic growth and the kind of world that Paul and I want to see. And then, of course, in the kind of countries that Paul studies, not only is there no incompatibility, but there's an essential link.
Mm.
Yeah. So, but let me say something in support of the question that I think as it were, the drumbeat of advertising has encouraged a sort of focus on stuff. I take the Financial Times, and each Saturday we get this thing, How to Spend It, which is a sort of grotesque display of opulence and affluence that nobody in their right mind would look like that or buy that sort of stuff. I'm
afraid they do, Paul.
I've always assumed the title was in inverted commas, but perhaps I'm wrong.
I've been reading a lovely book called Triumphs of Experience, which is an unusual book. It tracks 250 Harvard students who were students in 1940, 1941, and it tracks them for 70 years. And so it's actually one of the very few studies that is able to say what leads to a life where you live till 90, where you manifestly have a good life, a satisfying life. And by over that 70 years, the divergence between the people who've committed suicide or, basically their life has gone into serious dysfunction of depression and so on, versus the people who've really got a good life is massive. And what are the factors that explain it? It's not big material success. What it is relationships. It's overwhelmingly meaningful relationships. And so I think we have got a bit of a skew through advertising and so on towards this sort of stuff-based pursuit or status-based pursuit. Whereas getting back to relationships are maybe not as marketable, but they're more meaningful. And I think that is actually something that is starting to become understood.
But also there's an important issue there, I think, which is that most people in prestigious, well-paying jobs, kind of like ourselves, like the jobs they're doing, and will go on doing them for as long as they can. There's a striking contrast there between these kind of jobs in the financial sector, where people are motivated essentially by money, and one talks to many people who are very rich, become very rich in the financial sector, and hate the job they're doing.
Yes.
Sadly, they also get on a kind of golden treadmill in which they realize they can't afford to get off it in terms of the increasing aspirations they have. Yeah.
That's also shown by this, quite right.
Forgive me,
meaningful jobs.
I want to try and get onto another question. This is a question from Theo. I'm an undergraduate finalist in history and economics here in Oxford, frustrated with the economic curriculum. If so many current thinkers agree that economics needs to be reformed, why has the undergraduate curriculum not changed? Paul, there are moves afoot to change it, aren't there?
There are indeed. There are indeed. I mean, it's very much related to the battle that John spoke about at the beginning. It's rebasing economics on a better understanding, I think, of two things. One is of human nature. So we're not saints. We are inclined to be greedy and selfish and lazy, but it's a complete travesty of human nature to say that's all we are. We're capable of being dragged down to that level, and the worst sort of firm does that dragging. It provides an institutional setting which reinforces those tendencies. But a good institutional environment encourages the better angels of our nature, and we're a very unusual mammal because we are hardwired to be more pro-social than any other mammal. So we've got better angels as well as worse. So that's part of it, really, I think.
One thing that has happened to me in the last few years is that I feel I've learned more about economics by reading things that weren't economics than things that were. And actually, Paul and I were on a call earlier in the day discussing issues with Joe Henrich, who's an anthropologist interested in evolution and anthropology at Harvard. And his book, Secret of Our Success, and a more recent book called Weird, are books that have both had a profound influence on me in the way in which I think about economics. And my recommendation to Theo would be go away and read The Secret of Our Success and ask your tutors why they aren't talking to you about some of these ideas.
So Theo,
let me add to that John's recent contribution of the explanation of radical uncertainty, because economics is still largely fixated on a known world. Wake up to a world in which we do not know what maximizing strategy would look like, and so we don't even try and maximize. And that's the world of radical uncertainty. So the combination of rethinking human nature, a better understanding of that, which is the collective mind, which is Heinrich and also Christakis, that plus facing up to radical uncertainty, they're the two big intellectual revolutions which economics needs to digest.
There were two interesting postscripts to that question. One from Samantha Knight saying the history curriculum similarly needs revision, and one from Donald Scharf, who points out that given the preponderance of Oxford PPE graduates in high places, perhaps we're responsible for some of the me in government. But let me go on to the next question, which is, well, actually it's from Samantha Knight. I think this is one for John. How do we best deal with the greed of multinationals, the greed is in inverted commas, of multinationals, which makes it so difficult for smaller domestic or regional firms and initiatives to compete? What sort of international regulatory framework do we need?
Well, I think if we think the answer is an international regulatory framework, we will be spending a lot of time for not very much outcome. I think there are 2 points there. One is that we have greatly weakened the application of antitrust policies in the last 20, 30 years. And the idea that the purpose of antitrust is to encourage pluralism, because most new ideas don't come from well-established companies. They come from smaller, innovative companies, is important to understand. But there's a corollary of that, which is people always exaggerate the power which established multinational companies enjoy. And a year or two ago, I was hung up by a BBC journalist doing a program, and she talked to me about the dominance of companies like Google and Facebook and so on, and said, are there any examples in history of large established companies like these that have actually lost their market position? And I said to her, look, it would be a lot easier to find examples. The difficulty is finding examples of companies that haven't. And whether it's General Motors or IBM or US Steel, which when it was formed in 1902 was by far the most valuable company in the world. And it's worth about the same amount today as it was worth in 1902.
And there's no overlap between the top 100 companies today and the top 100 companies 100 years ago?
Very little. ExxonMobil has for a long time been the survivor. You might ask how bright its future is now. And General Electric, US General Electric, was the other long-term survivor. And it too is a company in rapid decline. We're just watching Boeing, which dominated the civil aviation market for 50 years, a company that is seriously struggling.
And Shell reported
why is Boeing?
And why, yes. That goes back to my fall of the icon story.
Yeah.
I fear that this is going to have to be the last question, and I think it's for Paul. It's slightly different from what we've talked about, but something you've written a lot on. Shouldn't we now forgive all debts? And I think this is, the questioner is ghost answer in the machine. Shouldn't we now forgive all debts, which I assume is national debts, in order to meet climate change and planetary problems insoluble by capitalism? Debt, if I can rephrase it, debt forgiveness for national debt.
We need to do a lot more for poor countries, right? Undoubtedly. COVID has been a catastrophe for poor countries, not because of the health shock. On the whole, poor countries have handled the health shock better than rich countries. But the synchronized macroeconomic collapse in China, India, Europe and North America has produced 4 massive macroeconomic hits to the poorest countries in the world. I won't go through them, but lower commodity prices for a start. All of those hits are transfers from the poorest countries to the richest, inadvertent transfers. We need to have big money that compensates for that. I don't particularly want to do it through cancelling debts. I want to do it through proper new flows of money, because that can be, first of all, cancelling debts cuts off a lifeline. I'm dealing with some very fast-growing African countries that have been interrupted by COVID, but the last thing on earth they want to do is to close off access for the next 20 years to capital markets by having debts cancelled. They want to build reputation in capital markets, and by God, some of them have done it. And not all African countries. Some have behaved very responsibly, but some have built responsible behavior and good reputations. There's not enough public money to lift the poorest countries out of the mire of poverty. We need a lot of inflows from firms and inflows from capital markets. The tragedy is that we've not been able to tap into capital markets anything like enough. So we need public mechanisms which tap into capital markets. So the spirit of the question is absolutely right. We need a big financial help, but the actual mechanics of the question, debt relief, is not the right modality, I think.
John, anything you'd like to add?
Nope, I think that's... the one thing I would add would be that actually it's getting Western economic institutions to operate effectively in these countries, which is different from the spirit of a lot of the questions that have been asked. That's what will make the difference to poor people in poor societies.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there because we're coming up to the hour. Just before thanking you, I'd like to thank the audience for some great questions, and I'm sorry that I've only been able to do the top few. Our next talk is this time next week, when Chris Dye will be in conversation with Dame Sally Davis, talking about some of the issues about antimicrobial resistance going ahead. I'd like to hugely thank John and Paul for a really fascinating discussion. Paul, you answered Theo's question by giving him a reading list, and you were far too modest to say that what he really does need to do is to go away and read is dead, and when he's finished that, to go on to the future of capitalism and radical uncertainty. It's wonderful that economic thinkers such as you are writing for a general audience as well, and that will really make a difference. So thank you very much indeed for the fascinating conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles.